Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Screenage Kicks, episode 3. Allow us to introduce ourselves again for people who haven't met us yet. My name is Barry Deehan. I'm a Youth Health Promotion Officer with the Sexual Health Centre on Peter Street in Cork City. And I'm part of a team with my co-host today.
My name is Maura O'Farrell and I'm the other Youth Health Promotion Officer. I share a post with Barry.
And for people who have attended previous episodes, we normally give a fun fact about ourselves. And to date, we've told you that myself and Maura have started at the same time. We've reduced the amount of parking tickets that we've accumulated while we're working remotely. And another fun fact about ourselves today, we are and have found out very quickly within our working relationship that we share the fact that we are both Geminis. We share the same star sign. There's only a week between our birthdays. I'll refrain from telling you who's older. You can leave that one up to yourselves, you can guess. As we move through today, I just want to ask people if they wouldn't mind signing in through the chat function, message us privately with your full name. It's just because, I suppose, when we're issuing certificates, it helps us to decipher who's logged in. Some people log in on different accounts with different names, and people's email addresses are slightly different to their actual names as well. So again, if you can pop those into the chat for us, we'll be able to ensure that you receive the correct certificate when they do go out. Okay, so today's program is very much about sexuality and gender, and the session is about becoming familiar with the subject matter to feel more comfortable responding to young people on these matters. So today we'll be having a look at diversity, we'll be having a look at sexuality, gender, and resources, services, and supports relating to these topics. And at the very end, we'll have time for questions and answers. So if people do want to start popping questions into the chat function, we will be able to have a look at them as we run through the session, and we'll come back to them at the very end. Okay, so I just want to welcome everybody for logging in this morning. Thank you so much, and let's get started. So we'll start with diversity. I suppose I'm starting with diversity because it's very much an intricate part of our workshops. So throughout our workshops, we aim to be inclusive of all genders and sexuality types. And previous topics have been discussed to provide young people with a comprehensive foundation of human relationships and reproductive health without prejudice, bias, or exclusion. In the last episode, we introduced you to the concept of a group agreement. A core value within our group agreement is diversity, taking inclusion and acceptance and recognizing sameness and difference in what we need as human beings, and difference in how we act and what we believe to be true, and even question where our truths originate, whether it's from the internet or inherent values passed on or influenced by family, community, peers, etc. So what I have here is the definition of diversity. So the concept of diversity encompasses acceptance and respect. It means understanding that every individual is unique and recognizing our individual differences, including gender and sexual orientation, along with age, race, ethnicity, ability, and beliefs. It is about understanding each other and embracing and celebrating the rich dimensions of diversity contained within every individual. And as I said, this is a core value that we bring to our workshops to achieve acceptance and inclusion. And we do this through understanding. So how do we achieve understanding towards acceptance and inclusion? So we achieve this by exploring the fundamentals of human relationships and reproductive health, broadening our insights into the possibilities that lie beyond the binary and heteronormative culture. So what is sexuality and what does it mean? So as we previously identified, sexual health is an integral part of our overall health and an activity of daily living. So too is sexuality. Everyone is entitled to their own sexuality without being judged, isolated, or bullied. whether somebody identifies as heterosexual, which we know to be straight, and attracted to the opposite sex, or homosexual, which we may refer to as gay or lesbian, and attracted to the same sex, or bisexual and attracted to both sexes. Every individual is entitled to express their own sexuality without fear of discrimination. So sexuality is an integral part of the human personality and an aspect of personhood that is a complex dimension of human life and relationships. And every individual is entitled to express their own sexuality without fear of discrimination. So sexuality is the ability to have intimate relationships, experience sensuality, and express identity. So sexuality is part of being human. It's not exclusive to any one age group or any group of people. It's something that we all experience as human beings in some way, shape, or form. And it is influenced by dimensions of everyday life as well. And to, I suppose, give you an insight into what I mean by everyday life, it is very much made up of a number of dimensions when we take into consideration biological factors, psychological factors, cultural, social, and spiritual dimensions as well. So what should we have here? So we have, I've broken it down here. So we have the, I suppose, the internal model of sexuality. So what goes on inside an individual to make up their sexuality. So sexuality is the ability to have fulfilling intimate relationships. And when we look at intimacy, we look at the ability and the need to experience emotional closeness to another human being and have it returned. And what falls under this category is the likes of togetherness, familiarity, caring, sharing, love, lust, and vulnerability. And this applies to all types of relationships that we've discussed so far, whether it's with peers, friends, platonic relationships, family relationships, etc. We become familiar with these concepts, and these shape our sexuality as well. So sensuality being physical awareness and sensory awareness. So it's the awareness and acceptance and comfort with one's own body to experience physical and psychological pleasure of one's body and the body of others to form intimate sexual relationships. So it very much the physical and the psychological sensations known as arousal experienced through touch. Identity then is the third factor. So this refers to the development of personality, attraction to others, and a sense of who one is sexually. So including a sense of masculinity and femininity. It's what we do. So again, it's very much about expression. It's how we identify as straight, lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, and as you know, there are many more letters that follow on beyond that. For now, I will just be referring to it as LGBT for the purposes of the webinar, but we will be exploring other identities as well as we move through the webinar today. Again, sex, what we identify as physically, and gender identity and gender roles as well. So external influential factors then would be, I suppose, what makes up our individuality and our personality. So we have biological factors, the physical form we're born with, whether it feels right or wrong, is certainly part of who we are and connects very much to our physiological sensuality as well. So from our origins, we move into the physiological and the functioning. So again, sensuality, physiology, touch, pleasure, and having a sense of what feels good and what doesn't feel good, as well as reproductive functioning. This can be a source of inner conflict if the physical form doesn't feel right, but also conflicts with cultural expectations as well. So under cultural expectations, we develop our gender roles that we identify with which are modeled within our daily lives and informed by culture and norms, what we recognize to be masculinity and femininity, really. How we feel within ourselves may conflict with what we see every day and with cultural expectations that are placed upon us in our assigned roles. And as we get older, we become more fluid as we experience wider cultural systems and maybe identify with others that we relate to more so. And this relatability links us to our social connections. So relating to our social outlets and settings that nurture our need for connection with others that we find common ground with. And I suppose this can be said for young people in the context of developing relationships with their friends and the closeness with their friends, that their friends feel like their family. And this resonates a deeper sense of connection to feel part of something bigger. And this links us back to our biological essence and what makes us unique and what makes up our personality and individuality. Okay, as I've mentioned previously, I've mentioned heteronormative culture, and along with that, I want to introduce you to the concept of heterosexism as well. So we'll have a look at what heteronormative means. So heteronormative or heterosexual norm refers to the assumption that heterosexuality is the only sexuality. This can often cause other sexual orientations to be ignored or excluded. This can be, I suppose, this can very much be invisible in itself. We can carry these concepts subconsciously. So again, it's about acknowledging how powerful they can be as discriminators in everyday lives, and even dangerously so as subconscious behavioral norms, to the point of, so I wanted to bring these to the table today so we can start to shift the paradigm towards inclusivity and away from assumption. Heterosexism then is the assumption that being heterosexual is the typical and normal sexual orientation, with an underlying assumption that it is superior sexual orientation. This assumption often results in an insensitivity, exclusion, or discrimination towards other sexual orientations, gender identities, including LGBT. So again, it's reflecting on reductive attitudes and bias, and these tend to often go unchallenged, especially in youth-based settings where bullying, teasing, outcasting of LGBT young people can often go, as I say, unacknowledged. And we need to start looking at how do we challenge that appropriately. And again, introducing it to the concept of diversity is certainly aimed towards that. And again, I suppose heterosexism and heteronormative culture can very much be reinforced by media and television as well. For example, romantic comedies are generally about heterosexual relationships. We very rarely see same-sex relationships, I suppose, portrayed within media and within television movies. And I suppose, again, I don't know, do we have any Marvel fans on board today? I suppose I am a fan myself, quite a big one. And I suppose I always refer to a scene in X-Men where one of the young people comes out to his family as being a mutant, and the response from his parents and his family are, have you tried not being a mutant? And this is something that young LGBT people do face on a regular basis. And I suppose, again, the expectation that we fall into heteronormative ideologies, I suppose. So again, it's about just raising awareness and bringing these concepts to your attention so that we can be mindful of them and keep them in mind that we're not filtering into the heteronormative values. that may exclude young people who are experiencing gender confusion or gender identity issues. So examples of sexuality types would be heterosexuality, what we know to be, I suppose, straight. Heterosexual or straight people are sexually attracted to people of the opposite sex. Homosexuality, gay or lesbian. The term gay is usually used to describe same-sex attraction between men, and the term lesbian is used to describe same-sex attraction between women. Pansexuality. Pansexual people are attracted to people regardless of their biological sex, gender identity, or sexuality, and it's more about having an emotional connection with somebody. Bisexual people are attracted to men and women. You might also hear the term bi or bi-curious in relation to bisexual people, where there is a bit of fluidity around sexuality. Asexuality. Asexual people experience no sexual attraction. This is not the same as abstinence, whereby a person decides not to have a sexual life. And again, it's more focus on emotional relationships. So queer then we have as an umbrella term used to describe people who aren't heterosexual. This term was once used as a term of abuse for people in the LGBT community, and it's now being reclaimed by many as an umbrella term for people who are not exclusively heterosexual. Some people still have negative associations with the use of the word and do not find its use acceptable. Again, as I mentioned there, it is a term that has been adopted as an empowering term and reclaimed within the LGBT community. But again, can be very much used as a derogatory term in certain settings. So all this considered, the factors that do, I suppose, come from within ourselves, the factors that influence us externally, and giving these examples of sexuality types with it can, I suppose, come certain processes of coming out and acknowledging our own identity in terms of sexuality. So what we're going to look at the moment is coming out and ages and stages. So where people experience, I suppose, an acknowledgement and somewhat understanding of sexuality. So this report from LGBT Ireland, released in 2016, gives a few facts and figures of where people are at and what ages people do start to acknowledge and recognize their sexual identity. So 12 years is the most common age that people discovered their LGBT identity. At 16 years of age is the most common age where people told the very first person that they are LGBT. 1 in 4 people who had come out had not told their mother or father they are LGBT. So again, opting to come out to friends or siblings before informing their parents. And the gap between knowing and telling decreased with age. So lowest for LGBT teens, but 1 to 2 years is a significant length of time at a critical time of their development. So this is to say that the older people got, that the time between coming out, acknowledging and coming out and discovering was very much shortened. So if somebody was to come out or if somebody was to discover their LGBT identity at 12 years of age, they may not come out till 16, but if somebody of 16 years discovered their LGBT identity, they may come out a lot sooner. And 3% had not come out to anybody, and these were more likely to be younger people, so bisexual and intersex people as well. Okay. So having looked at the ages, we'll have a look at the stages of coming out. So again, these are stages identified in the caste system of identity. So identity confusion refers to, I suppose, an individual's feelings of difference, but are often unable to identify why. So they may begin to wonder if they are LGBT, and they rely on the reactions of people around them to understand whether LGBT is right or wrong. We have identity comparison. So identity comparison means individuals in this stage compare themselves to other LGBT individuals in their environment and in media, and ask themselves, does this fit for me? And as we acknowledged a while ago, there isn't a lot of representation in media for role modeling either. We have identity tolerance. So what this means is where an individual is at a stage of admitting to themselves that they are LGBT, but view it as no one's business but their own. They may grieve for the loss of privilege and fear, potential alienation really, and loss of family, friends, and employment. So again, it's the fear and the wonder of how coming out can seriously affect close relationships and potential career opportunities, and how they're going to be treated in those spaces. So identity acceptance then is where an individual is at a stage of beginning to feel that they will be okay, and have a more positive sense of identity as they develop an understanding of what their sexual identity means for them. And they may begin to come out to others and seek out the LGBT community as a whole and explore that a little bit more. So with that then, I suppose there is a development of pride in sense of sexuality. So the realization their identity is fully legitimate and they are out, proud and visible. Their identity may be wrapped up in being LGBT, and it can be a little bit consuming at this stage. And they may feel a little anger at how society has stifled them in the past. And they may have fewer straight or cisgender friends and have little patience for closeted people, not understanding why people don't take the opportunity to come out based on positive experiences within the LGBT community. And then we have identity synthesis. So this is where individuals feel more settled in their identity. They know that they're more than LGBT, they're LGBT, and it's very much affirmed within themselves. But they also understand that like their LGBT identity is an important part of who they are. And it's a stage where being LGBT isn't their whole identity, but it's part of their whole identity. And again, it's about synchronizing back into and reintegrating with other communities outside LGBT as well. They may still have a sense of anger and frustration, but it is tempered by a holistic view. They have a sense of pride and self-confidence in order to, I suppose, reintegrate with the relationships that they once feared they might lose. Okay. So some issues arising for LGBT young people from this is pressure to conform or fit into heteronormative society, fear or worry of rejection, fear of being outed, absence of mentoring and advice. And I suppose at this stage, just want to say that, like, I suppose within the context of workshops and whatnot, we do get asked quite a lot if we do provide LGBT specific sexual health workshops. And I suppose, again, as I say, all of our workshops aim to be as inclusive as possible and come to sexual health from a human perspective and how it affects all of us as human beings, as opposed to individual sexualized beings. But at the same time, we do get asked by a lot of young people to create inclusive workshops so that they're not excluded, that they're not invisible, that they're not made to feel any different from anybody else. So it is, I suppose, from a young person's perspective, that it's really important that people are, I suppose, receiving sexual health workshops as a core group and not as separate or excluded groups. So we have exclusion or invisibility in everyday situations. As I mentioned earlier, heteronormative culture can see exclusion of young people not being acknowledged, so where bullying can occur and it's just dismissed that, okay, they chose to come out, so that they're going to be subject to these things. But it is really important that we challenge heteronormative attitudes as well that do impact people negatively. So again, we have young people building a reliance on online communities and sources of information where they may become vulnerable and subject to predators, as well, as we've spoken about previously as well in other episodes. So we just need to be mindful of where young people are getting their information and the communities that they're engaging with as well. So when we're talking with young people around these issues, it's really about, I suppose, acknowledging mindfulness around how we talk about LGBT issues with young people and sexuality as a whole. So it's really important to celebrate diversity, ensure inclusion and acceptance all around. Understanding the concepts of heteronormativity and heterosexism helps us remove them from our own mindset and create a more inclusive space. Being mindful that not all young people live in a household that talks openly about relationships and sexuality. So again, if somebody is exploring their sexual identity and feels that they may be LGBT, they may not be able to explore these thoughts and feelings with somebody at home on the basis that they live in a heteronormative household, for example. So gender and sexuality can be fluid throughout the development of attitudes and values and with age. And as I say, the wider circles that we do engage in, we can adopt different values and behaviors as well. And it's really important to reassure young people that sexuality is a fluid aspect of being human as well. And creating and identifying safe spaces and practice positive role modeling. So again, checking in with ourselves, ensuring that our own attitudes are inclusive and accepting, and that we can challenge any negativity and bias as well. Okay. Often, young people who identify as LGBT can disengage from the processes of sexual health education on the premise that they feel it does not apply to them. And again, as I say, there is two sides to the coin, where LGBT young people want to engage with their heterosexual peers in the likes of sexual health education. And at the same time, I suppose it's really important that we take into consideration how we deliver sexual health education to all young people to make sure that it is inclusive and that we don't adopt those heteronormative approaches towards sexual activity and sexual relationships. So that concludes the section on sexuality. I'm going to hand you over to Mira now for the gender aspect of our workshop. Thanks very much. Sorry, Mira, we can't hear you. You're on mute.
Thank you, Barry. Yeah, I am just going to share my screen, so I'll just swap with you.
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, I set up new subtitles. As you can all see, there's always loads of question boxes attached to things. But welcome to session 3, everybody. It's lovely to see you again. So Barry spoke about sexuality, so I'm going to follow on from that and talk to you today about gender. So the reason we've paired these two areas together, I suppose, just to explain a little bit, is gender and sexuality always seem to be two areas that people get very confused around. They're not really sure how to separate them or to answer questions. And I think it's really important that there is a distinction here, and that as professionals working with people, it's really nice for somebody just to go through it and try to simplify it. So that's my plan for today. I'm going to do my best. We're going to talk about the different types of genders that exist. We're going to talk about pronouns. And then we're going to talk about the supports that are available for people around LGBT issues in general. So we'll kick off with, I suppose, just an explanation of gender. So gender identity is about a person's sense of their own gender. So often I think, it's something that we think they're very specific or set genders, and there aren't. And I think a really good way to differentiate between sexuality and gender is this example of filling out a form. So if you imagine that you went to a sexual health screening or to a service, on the form, they'll generally ask you your name, your address, maybe your phone number and your gender. So there'll be male, female. Hopefully on most forms nowadays, you'll get different options like other, or you can specify a gender, but nowhere is ever going to ask for your sexuality. So who you're attracted to. So you're not going to find a form that says, tell me your name, tell me your phone number, your address, and what kind of people do you think you're sexually attracted to? It just wouldn't happen. So gender, I think that's a really good way that we explain it to young people sometimes is gender, think of a form, think about just the basic information about yourself, whereas your sexuality is more private and a more personal thing about yourself and who you're interested in. So people don't always fit into the traditional male or female genders, and these people can feel excluded simply by the fact of not having their gender on a form. So as I said, it can be really important if you have a service or if you're working with young people, just to add an additional box in terms of forms or filling things out to make it more inclusive, and so that people don't feel invisible in society, that there is a place where they feel they fit and their gender is accounted for. So simple things like that can go a long way. This then is called the gender-bred person. So I'm sure some of you might have seen this before. It's a free kind of graphic. It's available online to download or to use, but it can be a really handy way if you're working with people of figuring out and discussing gender with them. So what it is basically is the gender-bred person. So we all are aware of the gingerbread man, and this is our gender-neutral version of that. So the person, as you can see here on the left, they talk about identity. So gender identity is on a spectrum, I think is the easiest way to think about it. So this arrow that we have here shows you the full spectrum. So you can have somebody who identifies as a woman, you can have somebody who identifies as a man, and they'll be at the far ends of the spectrum. Whereas there is people who identify somewhere in between. So they might identify as a little bit more male, but somewhere in the middle, or a little bit more female, but somewhere in the middle. And using these scales with young people that you work with can be a really nice way where they can just circle where they feel they might fit and get an idea of how they're feeling about themselves, their sexuality and their gender. So gender expression then talks more about how we dress and how we look on the outside. So we're all very aware of, the very traditional strong female look. So, things that come to mind for me are the red lipstick, high heels, long hair. And masculine, you have I think of maybe an Arnold Schwarzenegger type with the muscles and, the big arms, and this kind of beastly man as being extremely a masculine ideal. But in the middle of that, we can have something androgynous, which is somebody who doesn't really identify as male or female. And if you saw somebody like that, you mightn't be able to tell whether they're a man or they're a woman. So they might have their hair shorter or somewhere in between. They mightn't wear these very identifiable, female garments or male kind of stereotypical body types. So people fit in all across these spectrums, and everybody is different and everybody is acceptable within this. Biological sex then obviously refers to our sexual organs. So some people can be born female, so they might, be born with a vagina and they identify as female. You can have a male who's born with a penis who identifies as male. And somewhere in the middle of that, they have intersex, which is somebody who may present as a male on the outside, but may have female genitalia. Or equally, you might have somebody who presents very masculine. Is that the one that I said? Or the reverse, sorry. But it's just important to know that, again, biological sex, which refers to the organs, happens also on a spectrum. So, you know, it refers to the measurable organs. So I have here like female examples, ovaries, chromosomes, XX, and the male is penis, testes, and XY. So it really just shows that, you know, there is a difference, but there is an interim where they cross over. And then, as Barry spoke about this morning, sexual orientation then is more about who we're attracted to or who we're romantically or sexually attracted to. So heterosexuals are generally attracted to people of the opposite sex, homosexual people of the same sex, and bisexual people are attracted to people of both sex. So, you know, this, I suppose, little diagram, I've just included it here because it is a fantastic free resource to use if you are struggling with young people in terms of how exactly to address them, or you think they're struggling. You can use it for them to help find out an idea of where they fit, what areas maybe they're not sure of, and talk to them about it. And also, as Barry was saying, when you're doing sex education or if you're talking to people about sexuality and gender, a lot of the time for young people, as Barry was saying, they might have an idea from the age of 12 of their gender or their LGBTQ status, but they mightn't be ready to share that with peers or with other people, and they mightn't be sure themselves. So doing this in a general fashion is just something that can be used to give them an idea that they're not alone in this. They mightn't be ready to come out. Their anonymity might be very important to them, but they can see that there is a whole spectrum and somewhere they fit. And it gives them that security in the sense that they have a place that they belong and that this is normal, that we accept it, that, you know, everything is on a spectrum and that you have a place within that. So I just think it's very handy in that sense. If we look then at gender pronouns just in the general sense, gender pronouns are something that as professionals or in capacity building, it's always an area that people are kind of a bit confused about. You know, what is somebody's pronouns? Is it okay to ask? It gets really confusing and I just can't deal with it. Like, why can't everyone just be he or she? So I suppose it very much ties in with that sense of identity and acceptance and fitting into the world. So we have the binary genders where somebody identifies as male and female, and they will most likely use the gender pronouns of he, she, him, her. But for individuals who are not feeling that they fit into those categories, the ability to use gender neutral pronouns makes them, I suppose, it gives them a sense of purpose and a sense of place. So it's really important that we accept that and that we feel comfortable asking people their gender pronouns. So people might choose to use they, them, their, so the plural, which means they're not identifying particularly in the masculine or feminine. And then there are also gender neutral pronouns that have been, I suppose, designed or come up with, which are the ze, here, here's, which are not ones we've heard before, and they're designed to be unique to this, to fit into the idea that I'm gender neutral and these are my pronouns, and they're not something you've heard before because this is a different gender that I'm associating with. So it's really okay to ask somebody their gender pronouns. I think in the Sexual Health Centre inside, we have included in our sign-off or pronouns just to make it easier for people so that they know if they're writing me an email that I, for example, use she, her, and then somebody is aware and doesn't have to ask. So doing those little things can be really nice. And again, we're just opening up society to the fact that there are people with different pronouns and not making assumptions around that. So I think the easiest way to probably go through the different types of genders and demystify and make it as clear as possible for everybody is probably just to start on one end of the spectrum and work our way through. So I'm just going to talk about today some of the main genders that we come across. There are more than what we're going to cover today, but just to give you a general idea. So cisgender, I don't know if people have heard of this term before. Some of you may, some of you might not have. So cisgender is a term that refers to people who identify with their biological sex. So essentially people whose gender matches with the biological sex assigned at birth. So if somebody was born male, they identify as a male, they would be called a cis male. For example, a woman, she's born a female, she identifies as female, she would be cis female. And the pronouns that cisgender people generally use are the binary forms, so the he, him, or she, her. So male cisgender person would be he, him, female cisgender person, she, her. And as I said before, it's perfectly okay to ask somebody which language they prefer to use, as long as you're coming from a place of wondering and understanding. And I think that's always where, as professionals, or even just in life in general, sometimes we're afraid to offend somebody, but actually by not asking, we can be making it more awkward or offending somebody by using the wrong pronouns. So as long as we're asking out of, you know, can I just ask what pronouns do you prefer to use? he, she, no problem. That's perfect. I'll use those for you going forward. Somebody might say, actually, I identify as they, them. That's the pronouns that I prefer to use. No problem. We can use those going forward. And you're starting out from the right foot, and someone knows that you care about identifying them and using the correct pronouns for them. The next one then is transgender. So this is, I suppose, something that people come across a lot in their work and that we get a lot of requests around, and people aren't really sure. I think sometimes people are a bit nervous. And again, I think it's that thought of, I don't want to offend somebody. So maybe if we just don't deal with it or we don't ask, it's sometimes easier. So transgender, I suppose, is a person who is born either biologically male or biologically female, and they identify as the opposite gender. So if we take a transgender male, for example, is a person who is born biologically female but identifies as male, and they might refer to themselves. So again, within gender, there is a lot of terms and terminology and different terms that people feel fit their identity. So I've just picked some of the most common ones that you might come across, but again, there are more. So a transgender male might refer to themselves as, I'm transgender, I'm trans, I'm a trans person. FTM or F2M is female to male. So it suggests I was a female and I've transitioned to a male, or trans male. And the same for a female. So a transgender female was born biologically male, but identifies as female. And they might use the terms, again, transgender, trans person, M2F, which is male to female, or trans female. So that's just kind of a breakdown, I suppose, of the different versions of trans that exist. And then within that, most trans people will most commonly use the pronouns he and she to refer to themselves. So a transgender male will most likely want to use the term he, or a transgender female would prefer to be referred to as she. However, some use the gender neutral pronouns they and their in the singular use. So you might have a transgender female called Jenny, and Jenny would like to be referred to as they or their. So that's just, I suppose, an overview, and I hope this is making sense for everybody. If you do have any questions, or you want any further information on this, do just drop us an email in the chat and we can send on some. But we're just going to give you kind of a general overview today. And just to note, trans people may take hormones or have surgery so that their bodies represent how they feel on the inside. Not all trans people will choose to do this, and it doesn't make them any less trans. And I've just written in bold at the bottom here, because this is something that comes up a lot. It is impolite to ask somebody if they've had surgery. So there is a huge curiosity, I think, around trans people, and especially often among their heterosexual peers or people who aren't part of the LGBT community. Not necessarily meaning to be offensive, maybe some people are, but they can ask very personal questions to somebody, maybe about if they are a transgender male, so a female who's transitioning to a male. They'll often feel this need to ask them, like, oh, do you bind your breasts, which is wrapping them to present with a more flat-chested experience. That's a very personal question to ask somebody, and it's not necessarily something that somebody needs to do who's a transgender male. So unless somebody feels comfortable passing on that information or bringing it up themselves, we'll often advise people just to wait and allow somebody to disclose as much or as little information about their transitions as they choose comfortable to do. Intersex then is another gender. So intersex people have variations of sexual characteristics. So an intersex person may appear male externally but have female anatomy on the inside, or appear female but have male anatomy on the inside. Usually at birth, so when the baby is born, a doctor will assign a sex to the child based on their genitalia. So most commonly, if you have a baby and they have more male organs, they will be assigned a male gender. Now, often people can find in later life that they don't fit with this gender that was just assigned to them at birth, and people will decide to transition. So linked with this is the term hermaphrodite, and I'm just going to put it in here because this is a very outdated medical term, and people don't really like this within the intersex community. So if you're asking questions, you hear the term intersex, hermaphrodite was a word that was used previously to describe this, but it's not really appropriate, and it's not something that's liked to be used anymore. So we do not recommend using this term. Some people, but not all intersex people, may choose to use gender pronouns other than he or she. So again, this is very personal to the individual and comes back to that idea of just being comfortable asking somebody and bringing up that topic of what pronoun do you like to use? So they might choose to use pronouns like they, them, or again, we have the Z here, which is the other gender neutral pronoun. So always allow intersex people to identify what pronouns they like to use. It simplifies everything and it makes sure that everybody again feels accepted and heard within the community. Non-binary. So non-binary people don't prescribe to the traditional forms of male and female. They often use the term other. So I think Sam Smith, and I could be wrong here, but I'm pretty sure he came out as non-binary. So he is now using the terms they, them. So non-binary people don't identify as exclusively male or exclusively female. So they may use the pronouns they, them, or again, the Z here, or the other ones that were on the list. So there's a whole list of gender neutral pronouns that people can choose from. So I always think, and I've included here, that this is a lovely term or description for a non-binary. So Native American tribes use the term two-spirit to describe a person who is both male and female. And I think, you know, a lot of our terms or the words that we use for things can be quite medical based or very descriptive, but in a more factual way, whereas this is just kind of like a beautiful way of putting something that really represents that. So two-spirit is a Native American term, and genderqueer is another term which you may hear in relation to non-binary people. So again, you can ask somebody their pronouns and they may decide to tell you what term they like to refer to their gender as. Often, if you're filling out a form or if you're talking to somebody, just leaving that box open if you're not sure what you'd like, you know, or what you think is appropriate to put in it, just putting other and specify. Somebody can let you know themselves then what their gender is and what they identify with. So just in encompassing, I suppose, everything that we've talked about here. So when we consider gender and sexuality and all that is encompassed within, I suppose, the experiences of this community and what they have to deal with, LGBTI mental health is a huge issue that arises. So if we look at just some of the, I suppose, the issues that are dealt with within this community, this again is the LGBT Ireland Report 2016. So LGBT individuals experience 2 times the level of self-harm than their heterosexual peers. They experience 3 times the level of attempted suicide. They have 4 times the level of severe or extreme stress, anxiety, and depression. Intersex people had the highest scores for depression, anxiety, and stress, followed by transgender and bisexual people. And those aged 19 to 45 were more likely to have taken recreational drugs, which is 2 times higher compared to the general population. So just within the LGBT community, we can already identify that there is a lot of things happening, and often these are as a result of experiences or difficulties that people experience, and that these stressors and mental health issues arise. So as professionals working within this community, it's so important that we offer this sense of acceptance and understanding. If we're not sure, that we're open to learning and asking and being aware of it, and also that we understand the issues that are faced so that we can help and support people better. So if we look at what really, I suppose, is going on behind this, so where are these numbers coming from, what's happening for this community, and what can we do to help, because that's really what we're looking to do. So this is called the Heterosexual Questionnaire. Again, I don't know if anybody's come across this before, but I use this a lot in the workshops, especially with young people or just with groups that we do, to really get a sense of like walking in someone else's shoes. So what does it feel like? Can you imagine it? So as a heterosexual female, I suppose for me, sometimes I imagine and I sympathize with the community and I think I understand, but sometimes unless you can actually feel what that would be like for yourself, you're not really sure that you do. And when I came across this questionnaire and we started using it in work, it really just kind of hammered it home for me. And I was like, oh my God, okay, yeah, I see more now and I feel more and I have a reaction to this in terms of what it means. So this questionnaire was actually designed in 1972. So I think just keep that in mind as well. Like this has been around for that long and these issues are still happening and it's still so relevant. So what it is I've just picked 7 questions out of the questionnaire here for us to look at. But there's, I think, 15 to 20 questions in total, and it's a flip. So what Martin Rochlin did is he used this questionnaire to present that imagine we live in a world where homosexuality is the norm and heterosexuality isn't. And these are the type of questions that are usually faced by the homosexuals in our community. Now let's turn them around and look at them for ourselves. So what do you think caused your heterosexuality? So imagine parents, youth workers, people that you come across, doctors, family, friends asking you, so you come out as heterosexual and someone says, well, what do you think caused your heterosexuality? Or when and where did you decide you were a heterosexual? Is it possible that this is just a phase and you will outgrow it? Is it possible that your sexual orientation has stemmed for a neurotic fear of others of the same sex? Do your parents know you're straight? Do your friends know? How did they react? If you've never slept with a person of the same sex, is it not possible that all you need is a good gay lover? And why do you insist on flaunting your heterosexuality? Can't you just be who you are and keep it quiet? So I think this is just a really useful tool to really get somebody to think and imagine, what it must be like and what has been experienced by somebody who potentially is LGBT. And also how inappropriate if we do have some of these reactions or feelings or thoughts, or if somebody's parents had asked them, do your parents know you're straight? Equally, do your parents know you're gay? How inappropriate and how unhelpful that can be. So I think this is just a great tool and a great resource to kind of either check in with ourselves as professionals, use with youth to get them to understand the experience of potentially their LGBT peers, and also as professionals sometimes just to use to really be like, actually, there is a lot going on for this community. How can we step in and how can we help? So I suppose in terms of what we talked about when we talk about the LGBT mental health issues and what's experienced by the community, the research has shown, and what's really come up around this, is that LGBT community members experience something called minority stress. So I'm not sure how many people have come across this before, but minority stress describes the stress experienced by members of an already stigmatized minority. So everybody, all of us, we all experience stressors throughout our lives, but LGBT people, these stressors that they experience are unique. So they're not experienced by heterosexual people. They're chronic, so they relate to social and cultural structures, and they're socially based, so they're structural and institutional. So we all have stressors, we all have things that go on in our lives, but on top of those regular stressors, the LGBT community have an additional stress, which is this minority stress that only they experience. So if we look at what those stressors are for LGBT people: prejudice, victimization, stigma, and internalized homophobia. So these are unique. So prejudice relates to LGBT people's experience of perceived or preconceived opinions that are not based on a reason or an actual experience. So people making assumptions about them, or if somebody's, we hear a lot, like, oh, well, my dad says this about LGBT people, so I'm going to take that on. So there can be, a learned prejudice or something that people think. So that can be very hurtful and very challenging, and something that they have to overcome and deal with on a regular basis. Victimization relates to LGBT people's experience of violence and discrimination as a result of their sexuality. So this is an ongoing issue. So trans people can be, discriminated against because people don't know, what to do with them, or mightn't want to hire them because they think it's too difficult. And it can be really tough because no matter how good you are for something or how appropriate you are, somebody can still discriminate purely based on your sexuality. Stigma, so this relates to LGBT people's expectation of rejection and discrimination. So there is this inherent stigma, I suppose, within society, and also an expectation then that goes along with that of, if you're a member of LGBT communities, they have this almost awareness or expectation that this could happen or might happen or will happen, and therefore it can happen because people let things go, or they just assume they won't put themselves forward, or they won't try for things because of this stigma. Internalized homophobia relates to LGBTI people's direction of negative social attitudes towards themselves. So again, people, perceive that I'm not wanted or accepted in society, or maybe a religion, doesn't approve or include me, and therefore they take this on within themselves and they carry these burdens. So these extra stressors that relate to this community can result in sexual health and well-being disparities, and can present in both physical and mental health issues, as we saw. So it's really important for this community then that we as professionals help to build resilience. So in talking about and accepting gender and sexuality, and also linking them in with supports. So what is resilience, I suppose, and what are we trying to do? Resilience is a psychological quality that allows some people to be knocked down by the adversities of life and come back at least as strong as before. And what they've found is that resilient people find a way to change course, emotionally heal, and move towards their goal. So people who are resilient generally have positive attitudes, optimism, the ability to regulate emotions, and the ability to see failure as a form of helpful feedback. So as professionals working with LGBT individuals, it's our job, I suppose, to foster resilience and really help them in achieving this. And the best way that we can do that is to be open to understanding, to listen, and to support. And on top of that, then to really provide and link in with specific supports where needed. And that's where I am going to pass you over to Conrad in a second to really talk about the supports that are available for this community when we think about all of the issues that are faced within it. So we have huge issues of gender, sexuality, mental health, minority stressors, the need to build resilience, the need to be accepted and to put yourself out there, and how much or how little of yourself you share, and that people really respect individuals in the LGBT community. So Conrad is our LGBTI sexual health support advisor within the Sexual Health Centre. And Conrad has been working with us for a couple of months, and I'm so excited to have him on the webinar with us today to really share with you the work that he does and to be, I suppose, a point of contact and a support that potentially you could refer into if you are working with anybody that you think could really do with a support service. So Conrad, I'm going to let you take over and really introduce your service and yourself to everybody.
Great, thanks a million. It's great to be here. So yeah, my name is Conrad M. I'm the LGBT sexual health support worker. So I suppose my role is there because the LGBT community face different challenges when it comes to sexual health. Obvious issues might be the issue that there's a higher risk in relation to HIV and other STIs. There's a lack of visible healthy relationships for people to base their own relationships on or to model their own relationships on. And there's a lack of LGBTI plus inclusive sexual health education and the lack of resources around certain areas of LGBTI sexual health. So you just want to move on to the next slide, Nora. Yeah, so the services then that we provide in the Sexual Health Centre. So I'd provide sexual health advice for LGBTI people, which focuses on healthy relationships, sexual issues, sexual function and dysfunction, and sexual orientation. As well, then I'd provide sexual risk information and brief interventions, focus on reducing risk, and then we provide coming out support in relation to sexuality and gender. And then as well, for people, we can provide support on navigating relationships with families and peers who might be struggling with their, I suppose, brother or child or family member that's coming out as LGBT. And I also then provide sexual health advice and training for youth workers and professionals. And at the moment I'm working with the LGBT youth group to create our own inclusive workshop with topics that they think are important to them to hear, and stuff that they don't really get taught in school or anywhere else. I suppose my job is to provide support to people around sexuality and gender with the aim of reducing risk and to work on capacity building with individuals and groups and professionals. Provide a one-to-one service for people that are struggling with coming out or sexual health. And again, if you want to go back, I think my contact details are on that slide. It's very small, but if anyone does want to contact me anyway, my email is conradm@sexualhealthcentre.com, and I'll try to get back to you as quickly as possible. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask here or to email.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Conrad.
Thanks a million, Conrad.
If anybody can't see that, sorry, it's smaller than I intended on the slide. If you just email us at education@Sexual Health Centre, we will forward Conrad's details as well to you, and any leaflets or flyers, if you'd like to put them into your services, we can provide that as well. So just to, I suppose, wrap up today, we will do some take-home messages. So we'll just do a quick recap of everything we covered. So I'll let Barry start off.
So sexuality is the ability to have intimate relationships, sensual experiences, and express identity. Diversity celebrates acceptance and inclusion. And every individual is entitled to express their own sexuality without fear or discrimination.
So gender identity is about a person's sense of their own gender. So examples of gender identity include cisgender, transgender, non-binary, and intersex. It's perfectly okay to ask somebody which language they prefer to use if you're coming from a place of wondering and understanding. And pronouns can include he, him, she, her, they, their, ze, here. Minority stress is the stress experienced by members of an already stigmatized minority, and LGBTI plus individuals experience unique stressors, including prejudice, victimization, stigma, and internalized homophobia. So that is it for today's webinar. Thank you very much. Don't forget to sign up for session 4. So the last of our webinar series is happening on the 15th of December. We're going to cover HIV awareness. Same time, and it is available on the Eventbrite link again. So we'll be advertising it on Twitter, etc. as usual. But if anybody hasn't signed up, please do so. Thank you so much for coming. It was lovely to have everybody here today. And if anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask, you can just pop them into the chat box. Chat box, and we will do our best to answer them now today. Or if anybody would like to ask a question anonymously, you can email us as well on education@sexualhealthcentre.com. If anybody isn't as well, I'll just highlight to everyone, please do follow us on Twitter, so SHC_Cork, or Facebook or Instagram. So all of the advertisements for any of the work that we're doing or any further webinars will be available on that. So it's a great way just to keep in touch with everything that we're doing. So thanks a million.
Thanks very much. And just to highlight as well that we are providing workshops to young people associated with Cork Education Training Board. So the likes of Youth Reach, YMCAs, we are delivering these workshops virtually. So again, we're able to set up a web link for youth groups to join in on our workshops as well. So if there's any queries around that, we're happy to answer any questions as well. Okay. I suppose, yeah, again, just so important not to make assumptions about someone's sexuality or gender. Be one of the take-home messages there as well today. Just one question that we received through the chat function there as well. So again, it's just a question in relation to what wording can be used in the gender section when form filling. Is the word other sufficient, or is there a better word? I suppose, again, response to this is that it's very much dependent on the individual's comfort and confidence in answering that question, and depending on what the form is for. I suppose, as Mira spoke about trans people there a while ago, I suppose one of the challenges that can come up is for a female to male trans person seeking out birth control and filling out other in a form as such can lead to further questioning and curiosity from professionals. And again, I suppose professionals across the board need to be familiar with these terms, and it's about building relationships with people who are familiar with these terms as well in a professional context. And I suppose in terms of filling out forms, it's about being as particular as you need to be in terms of medical forms. But again, is it, I suppose it's down to the person's ability to respond in comfort and confidence in responding to further questions as to how specific they are in these forms. Do you have anything to add to that, Mira or Conrad?
I'd say, so again, as you were saying, it depends on what you're looking for the information for, first off, but it's good to have another option. And suppose, say for instance, Hospital in Dublin have updated their forms now to include gender identity, gender at birth, and preferred pronoun. I've also dealt with a few questions from students in CIT who didn't have the right options when they were applying for their course. So I'm trying to push them to include asking for preferred pronouns, so they don't have to have that conversation with each lecturer separately. So again, yeah, it depends on what you need information for and what type of service you're providing, I suppose, yeah.
Yeah, and I suppose just to add into that as well, if anybody is uncertain about a form that they have or they'd like us to review it, we can certainly do that in the centre. We can work with you or just review a form, get some expert opinions on it and really figure out what is appropriate and what isn't and put together a plan for it. So again, for any issues like that or any questions, don't be afraid to drop us an email at education@sexualhealthcentre.com.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I suppose it's quite circumstantial and individual to the purpose and function of the forum as well. In terms of, I suppose, again, designing forums is other a suitable third option. Again, I suppose the term other is quite ambiguous, and depending what the forum is for, can be very excluding in itself as well. So again, I suppose trying to be as specific as possible without excluding anybody and making sure that everybody does feel comfortable in answering those questions. Any other questions come in for you guys?
I have actually lost the ability to see the chat box, so I'm not too sure is the answer to that.
Okay. I think that's it for today.
If anybody has submitted a question that we haven't gotten to, we will of course answer it by email and get back to you. But thank you so much for attending and we look forward to seeing you at the next one.
Bye.
Thanks very much, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.